Hey everybody, this is Chris Jerome with the Radical Independent, and I'm here with Jason Faler, Independent for U.S. Congress in Oregon's 6th Congressional District. I came across you, Jason, Independent Veterans of America. They endorse you, which is good enough for me. I know you talk a lot about the intense partisanship that prevents meaningful legislative action. Solving problems is not the priority, right? And that's kind of right up my alley. Before we kind of get it, before we get into that, can you give us a little bit about your background? And I mean, you're not a career politician, right?
Not a career politician, never run for office before in my life. No. But have served the country, going on 27 years in uniform. I'm still in the Army Reserve.
Oh,
Just got selected for promotion to colonel. So waiting on Senate confirmation for that. So that's really where my heart is, and the backstory to this is there's some tie-in and some nexus with the reason that I even chose to raise my right hand and join our nation's fighting force and wear the uniform back in 1999. Quick story. This is not the only reason, but the quick context and background, and that is I was studying abroad at the American University in Cairo for a year. As I was a student there, I had a lot of opportunities to travel throughout the Middle East fairly extensively, and I did so. A lot of things were educational and eye-opening about that, especially as a young man. At that point I was 22 years old. But one of the things that was particularly interesting and prominent to me was the fact that the socioeconomic stratification in that part of the world, and frankly in many parts of the world, is pretty distinct. And whatever fortune or luck or the lack thereof decides to have you born into, whatever socioeconomic class you're born into, generally in that part of the world, you're destined pretty much to stay in that.
right.
There's not a whole lot of upward mobility or class transition. And I thought a lot about that and juxtaposed that, with my own experience. And my dad grew up in abject poverty, really, really poor, single mother, living alone in very much abject poverty. But my dad was a hard worker, smart guy, and kind of did the old bootstraps thing, put himself through college at Oregon State University, became a CPA, and eventually owned his own CPA firm. And, because of that, he really transcended quite a few socioeconomic classes and barriers. And because of that, I too, although I spent a lot of my youth growing up helping out on my mom's side of the family. Her family had a large farm that I spent a good portion of my youth doing a lot of physical labor, blue collar type stuff, moving irrigation pipe in the mud and feeding chickens and milking cows and things like that. But I lived in a part of the town that I grew up in Salem, which was probably the more affluent part of town. I certainly did not grow up with a silver spoon in my mouth, but I also really wanted for nothing. And, that was none of my doing. That was all because of two things. Number one, my dad's work ethic and intellect, and also because that's the American dream, right? We've always had this thing that we call the American dream, which is that if you work hard, pay your dues, you can become something more than you were born into. And certainly, we've had this assumption that every generation would do a little bit better than their parents. For that reason, I really thought that was something, as I traveled a lot in the Middle East, and I saw that that's not that whole idea of the American dream and working hard, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and becoming anything, theoretically, that may not be uniquely American, but it is very American. And it
Right.
certainly is not something that's available to everybody in every part of the country. In fact, very few in the grand scheme of things. So I felt like, number one, I needed to really let my dad know how proud of him I was and how grateful. But number two, I felt like I had something I wanted to give back to my country, because my country also made that a fertile environment for my dad to be able to do that. And I was a beneficiary of that directly. And that was it played a big role, if not the biggest role, in me choosing to join, raise my right hand and join. I joined as a private 11 Bravo light infantryman. Eventually went to officer candidate school and became an officer. But the intent was to just serve for 6 years, do one contract, and get out, just as a nod to what this country has enabled. Fast forward, 27 years later, we're not exactly in the same situation.
Right.
The haves continue to have a larger and larger share right? The very small fraction of the highly wealthy and privileged, right? I'm talking the top 1/10 of 1% of the wealthiest in this country continue to grow an incredibly outsized portion of the total wealth in this country. Corporations are doing better than they've ever done. They're more profitable. They're more efficient. Their productivity has gone up year over year over year. Yet those of us who are doing the work to make those corporations profitable, and therefore the executives and the billionaires who profit from them, the private equity firms, et cetera, are not sharing in that wealth that's been created,
Yeah.
are not sharing in the spoils of that productivity and profit. In fact, even folks making six figures are having a hard time making ends meet today because those wages are actually barely keeping up with the cost of inflation, while again, the wealthiest of the wealthy continue to grow their share, outsized share of the total wealth. So it's just interesting, kind of that juxtaposition. But that's the entire reason that I joined. More background about me. I'm a fourth generation Oregonian. I've lived in this state my entire life, but for a few years on the East Coast, where I was going to law school and grad school, and of course my year that I did abroad studying, and my combat tours that I've done in the Middle East and the Horn of Africa. So very deep roots in this state. Very, very proud of this state. Also, much like I'm disappointed in the trajectory of this nation. We'll get into that, but a little bit disappointed in the trajectory of this particular state too.
Right.
We're now the fifth most expensive state to live. In the top 5 in terms of worst states to retire in. Taxed to the high heavens. And I'm not a guy who necessarily complains a whole lot about paying taxes if the quality of life seems like that is increasing commensurate with your taxation. If you're getting what you pay for, I don't want to pay unlimited taxes, but if I can see some results of those in terms of safety, quality of life, et cetera, at least there's that. But we are not seeing that. In fact, I think most Oregonians see an inverse of that.
That social mobility you mentioned earlier, relating to your service and sort of that background, it's so important, and it relates. So it's a huge question mark today. I mean, I deal with 17 and 18-year-olds a lot, and this is the world they're growing up in. It's not the America I grew up in,
No.
and this idea of working hard and moving ahead when the younger generation feels like the system's just broken or rigged, and no matter what they do, they're stuck. And I mean, that's so destabilizing. That's such a huge problem. And it's you kind of mentioned that corporatism, that kind of crony capitalism, where economically things have just kind of there's some structural issues at play here.
Yeah, and I think there are absolutely some structural issues here. The system is rigged against the vast majority of us right now. It has not always been, but it currently is. And one thing, just as sort of a side note digression, as I say things like that, when I'm out talking to people, I very passionately like to remind people that the first 3 words in our Constitution are "we the people." Any bit of authority and power vested in our Congress, our executive branch, and our judiciary flows from us,
Right.
We people. And we have the ability to tear it down. In fact, it's designed specifically for that purpose, and we forget that. It also requires us to work in unison, in unity, as a nation, as a people. And one thing, a major reason that I'm running as an independent is because these 2 parties have strategically pitted neighbor against neighbor.
Right.
They have, over time, set up camp more and more on increasingly extreme fringes of the political spectrum, while leaving the vast majority who live somewhere in the middle without a tent anymore. And that's why, quite frankly, we've talked about this sort of independent wave, which we are red waves and blue waves, depending upon certain election cycles. There's an independent wave, and it's coming for us. And I couldn't be more thrilled about that. Here in Oregon 6th District, and the state kind of mirrors this, and a lot of the country does as well.
Right.
Almost 40% of the registered voters are now unaffiliated with either party. We have left the parties in droves because the parties have failed to represent us. And part of that reason is, or a big part of that reason is because our elections are no longer about democracy. Our elections look a lot more like auctions. A big reason for that is Citizens United, as we have rivers of billions of dollars flowing into our election. And when I'm up against, as an example, an incumbent candidate who raised last election cycle $3.3 million, 93% of that from outside the district that she represents.
Right.
That
And
ought
you're
to
just
tell you
scrambling. You're just scrambling to get signatures, and these people are raising millions, right?
exactly. And because of Oregon election laws, which we can get into this later too, but because of Oregon election laws, independent, not affiliated voters are not allowed to participate in the primary. We don't have
Right.
open primaries. We don't have ranked choice voting or anything like that. They're very traditional. So while neither major party candidate ran, neither of them were opposed. They ran completely unopposed in the primary, so they didn't have to spend a dime or lift a finger defending themselves from, an intra-party challenger or anything like that. And they could just sit on their coffers and wait to employ their strategies and their dollars, at the appropriate time before the general election, and coasted straight there. Yeah, I am struggling mightily, A, to raise dollars, B, to get 3,532 signatures, valid signatures from registered voters in Oregon's 6th Congressional District by the 10th of August is when I need to turn those into the Secretary of State. And we're in danger of potentially not getting those. Part of that is because, again, the system is designed against us, right?
Yeah.
I wrote an op-ed in a piece called The Fulcrum, and I characterized the system as much like a moat. It's designed to keep insiders safely inside and the rest of us the hell out.
Right. Well,
Because here in Oregon,
yeah, one of my catchphrases that I constantly say is a corrupt rig duopoly. And it's
right.
exactly like you say. The radical independent, I'm all about free, fair, and competitive elections and
Absolutely.
dismantling the outsized power of the corrupt rig duopoly.
And
So
and part of
what I like about your campaign, especially, is that you have a fairly robust reform agenda. A lot of people have their policy issues, and that's cool, no problem. Do that too. You've got whatever ideology, but
yeah,
the fact that you're looking at reforms, constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, term limits, getting money out of politics, ending gerrymandering, stuff like that.
yeah.
That's huge. That's how you break things down. And you're
I don't
totally
think
right.
anything else is possible
Yeah,
without dismantling these underpinnings of why things are the way that they are today.
right.
And
One,
and
one
I truly believe that the dollars in politics have been the catalyst for everything else. That and um, loyalty to party over country, and loyalty to
Right.
special interests and campaign donors and
Yeah.
billionaires and political action committees, as opposed to the voters and the people that they should be feeling privileged to represent. That's their entire job, is to represent the people. But instead, they're thinking about the next election and only the next election. And
Yeah.
you and I and all the other individual voters that are ostensibly represented by these folks in Congress are not. We are at best a distant third behind, depending upon the day, the party, right, and the party ideology, and
Right.
the
And the
the
donors.
necessity to get in line if you want to get good committee assignments, access to the infrastructure and the funding that the party has available,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and right, one or two depending, all the special interests that are funding their campaigns, right? These special interests, these corporations, these billionaires, these PACs, they are not charitable entities. They are not donating to these members of Congress out of the kindness of their hearts. They're donating because they expect that when they have a favor, when there's a favor they need, they expect to call it in.
Right.
Period.
Yeah.
And that's it, and that's the only reason. They're
Yeah.
buying votes and buying elections for these candidates. And in my opinion, when you start with party ideology and you work your way backward, you've already gone wrong, right?
Right.
As opposed to starting with what's best for, in my case, Oregonians and Americans collectively, and working with whoever the hell it takes in order to achieve and accomplish those goals. That's the way it's supposed to be. And I'm old enough to remember an America that looked a lot more like that. It
Right.
was
Same.
far less divided, far more united, where we had two parties that sure didn't always get along and very much didn't agree from an ideological standpoint, but were willing to A, speak with decorum to one another, and B, reach across party lines and across the aisle
Right.
when it was beneficial for America. This is pre-Citizens United. Now there is no loyalty except to whoever the entities are that are going to get these folks reelected. So that is why I think term limits are a little bit of an antidote to that until we can figure out how we dismantle the Citizens United. Because although every statistic I read says that upwards of 80% of Americans want Citizens United overturned and they want corporate dollars out of it, the challenge in getting an actual constitutional amendment passed, Congress, the people, the state legislatures is a very, very steep hurdle. So I also like to see some of these states working on the enabling statutes for corporations. Hawaii and Montana are doing some things that I can't wait till that gets to the Supreme Court so we can test that, and ideally it passes the scrutiny of the Supreme Court. And I have my doubts with the Supreme Court in particular, but hopefully it passes that scrutiny, and 48 other states can do that, and we get around the necessity of a constitutional amendment. But I'm all for it. If that's the path we've got to take, that's the path we've got to take, because this is no longer a government by, for, and of the people. And it's so ironic that we just had the 250th anniversary of the founding of this great nation. If the founders had any inkling that there would be hundreds of billions of dollars flowing in to our elections, and the fact that elections look far more like auctions than they do democracy right now, they would absolutely roll over their grave. This is not the America that they intended.
Yeah, a constitutional amendment is just it's extremely hard. It's nice to throw it out there and kind of, have that as a potential something to work towards, but you got to find other ways as well.
Yeah.
The dollars are huge, but you also have that, you kind of alluded to it, that emotional tribalism, the team sport aspect, that social cultural, the part of the equation that people are just so wound up in the duopoly's manipulative scam, basically.
Yeah.
How do
Well,
you feel?
they've convinced us that we need to hate our neighbors, right?
Yeah.
Not just disagree with our neighbors about things, but
Oh, yeah.
actually in some cases
Yeah.
hate our neighbors.
Yeah. Pitting Americans against each other to stay in power, to control
Absolutely.
elections and stay in power. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. How do you feel about primaries? I know that's another reform issue. Do you have any thoughts about primaries? As far as like open primaries, I talk about independent primaries because the primary issue seems to be a big problem, because a lot of elections are basically won in the primary, right? There's not much competition in the general election, and in the primaries, that's kind of where the parties focus on the fringiest, loudest minority within their group. And so, any thoughts about the primary problem?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see open primaries here in Oregon, and America's been a great experiment, and we can continue to experiment with these things. If we don't get it right the first time, then we can, pop the hood and tweak a few things underneath to get it to a place that we're a little bit more comfortable. But there are examples that we can point to across the country with ranked choice voting and open elections.
Yeah.
As I'm out talking to voters, what I hear, of course, and by the way, the fact that we've got this huge independent wave and that almost 40% of registered voters, by far the largest segment of the electorate in my congressional district and this state. So it's almost 40% independent here in my district, 29% Democrat, 25% Republican. So not just by a little bit, by a lot. Right. What I have found as I'm out talking to voters is that the vast majority of those folks who are like, I'm an independent, I say, would you be surprised to learn that you're now part of the largest voting bloc by far in this congressional? And they say, what? Because it's one of the best kept secrets. The parties don't want you to know that they are bleeding voters and members and dollars because they have become so extreme. They want you to keep thinking that the only choice you have is to go to the ballot box, hold your nose, and vote for the lesser of two evils. And that is in fact not American at all. And that is in fact not the answer, especially now that electorate has changed so significantly. And so when they find that out, they start thinking, and this has been a key sort of epiphany for me, how important it has been for me to educate voters about the changing electorate, because conventional wisdom has always been a vote for an independent or a vote for a third party candidate is a throwaway. It's a protest vote, but they're not a viable candidate. That's largely been true, but the math has changed and it's changed massively.
Oh
So
yeah.
once people begin to understand that these independents are now the largest voting bloc, they start to think differently about their vote, and they start to rethink about the viability of an independent candidate. And I would put my resume up against either of the two major party candidates in this race any day of the week.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
so
I'm glad you mentioned ranked choice voting. That's a big one for me.
yeah,
I I talk about a lot of different ones, and I like them all. I'm not real particular, and I'm pretty non-judgmental on the reforms and the changes. I'm like, let's just try to get them all in, and but that's a pretty high one. So you mentioned that in your district, it's close to 40% unaffiliated. What has been your experience? Like, I feel like as an independent, you're kind of in a position to attract a pretty broad coalition, maybe because since you're independent, you might pick up some moderates from either party. You might pick up maybe even third parties. Have any other groups or third parties reached
I've
out
had
or
some,
shown any
yeah, I've had
support?
some third parties that have reached out. I've had some third parties that asked me if I would be interested in running under their banner. I definitely think that I have the ability to attract some of the moderates that are still registered with one or the other party. And one of the reasons that I think that is as I go and I talk to these voters and I'm soliciting signatures to for this petition to get me on the ballot in November. A lot of them are like say, as I've mentioned, hey, I'm an independent. Absolutely, we need more independents on the ballot. Some of them say, I think we need more independents, definitely. I'm still registered as a Republican or I'm still registered as a Democrat, but only because I want to be able to vote in the primary,
Right.
right? So again, underscoring the fact that the primary tends to just reinforce this system that is not working.
Right.
And again, I'm not an anti-party guy. That's not my platform. I don't. I'm not naive enough to think that if there were 535 members of Congress across both houses, none of them affiliated with some sort of either caucus or party or coalescing ideology.
Yeah. That's not realistic.
Things aren't going to be efficient. I'm not naive enough to think
Yeah.
that we can all be completely independent and unaffiliated with anything. But I think that that's what it has to happen at first, and then I am anti these two parties. They have had their
Right.
opportunity. They've had their
Well,
chance. They've shown true colors,
when
and they
the
have burned this
structures and
country.
processes are when the parties break the system and rig it and use corruption to prevent political competition, then it's a problem, right? Like the
Right.
parties inherently, okay, whatever, they do what they do. But when they're doing such terrible things, really, right now, with our structures and processes, and we need that systemic change. You're totally right. I love the number of quality and legitimate independents running this year is the most I've ever seen. It's
I agree.
great. And if we can just get a few independents in, it could really tilt the balance. You don't need 100. I mean, you only
Yeah.
need a handful because
Yep.
then neither party will probably have a majority. They'll have to appeal to the reasonable kind of, yeah,
Wouldn't that be a
change
great step forward?
everything. Yeah.
Yeah. And to go back to sort of some of the obstacles that I'm facing right now, I mentioned I've got to get 3,532 signatures, valid ones, turned into the Secretary of State by about the 10th of August next month. And I mentioned that we're in real jeopardy of not reaching that number, which would be a
Mm.
travesty. But part of the reason for that is it's 2026. We are well into the digital age, and I'm still out there collecting
Yeah.
signatures with pen, paper, and clipboard like it's the 1960s.
Yeah.
Why? Because that's the only way I'm allowed to do it per Oregon election laws, per the Secretary of State rules. You can sign a loan, a mortgage. You can do business with state entities like the department, like the DMV here in Oregon, by verifying your identity online, then going in and doing business as that verified individual. But for some reason, when in
Yeah. So for
2026,
some reason.
yeah, for some reason in 2026, when there is no public square anymore, not a physical one. And by the way, that's what I have to do is I have to get physical signatures on a physical piece of paper with a
Yeah.
physical pen, right? But I can't, there is no public square anymore. The public square is online. It's social media, it's digital, and that should be where we're allowed to collect signatures, but we are not. In addition, supermarkets, shopping malls, especially post COVID, and we've had a major homeless homelessness crisis here, fueled by tragic mental health and drug addiction issues in Oregon, like much of the country. And since 2020, when that really kind of started to spike, these private entities like grocery stores and supermarkets and shopping malls they don't want you there, and security will come and kick you out within just a couple of minutes. So you can either ask for permission ahead of time, and I can tell you 100% of the time that I've asked for permission, they've said no, because if we let you do it, we have to let everybody do it, or beg for forgiveness afterwards. But security usually comes within 30 to 60 minutes, so it ends up being very inefficient for us anyway. So what we're left with is knocking on doors. And
Yeah.
in 2026, I can tell you about 40% of the doors that I go up to have no soliciting signs. I respect people's
Yeah.
privacy. We don't knock on those doors, period. Of the ones that are left, and including the ones that have no soliciting signs, they've all got Ring and Nest and other kind of doorbell cameras. And who is answering the door to strangers in 2026?
Right.
It has
Yeah.
been
It's a different
incredible.
yeah, it's a totally different culture. I mean, these days it's just not what it used to be. I mean, I'm at home, man. Leave me alone. I can't,
Yeah,
so that's the mentality.
yeah,
And
I
like
get
you,
it.
all these other things, but that's a lot of independents have actually mentioned that the way we do things with the collecting signatures and some of the other stuff, it's so archaic now and it's a struggle. That's actually a more common complaint that I'm hearing.
Well, it's just a huge barrier. It's just an absolutely huge barrier. If I were able to, a lot of people go to my website and they sign up and they think that they're signing the petition by doing that.
Uh,
Um, so if we were late with, if we just, these are archaic rules, these are archaic methodologies, and we need to update those. So, I hope to work in parallel but separate from the campaign. I hope to work with the Oregon legislature to update this so that we can do things a little bit more digitally, because that's the world we live in and have been for a really long time.
right, right. Well, good luck. We definitely need more independents out there to shake things up. August 10 is the deadline for those signatures.
Yeah, yeah, we're working hard.
Yeah, we're gonna hope cross our fingers on that. I mean, the people who could offer practical solutions over ideology, serve country over party. I mean, that's what it's all about. So people can look you up at failerforcongress.com. I'll put
Yep,
that in the description.
Faler. Yeah, Faler for Congress.com. Or they just Google Jason Faler. That'll come up too. But yeah, I can use any support. But if people are interested, they can sign up for updates and send us all the well wishes that they can, because we really need that between now and about the next 3 weeks, trying to get those signatures.
For sure. Jason, thanks so much for being on.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. This has been great. Thanks for the opportunity.